Hi guys, let's do 2.4, 5, and 6, okay? Are you ready? These are the objectives for 2.4, which we're going to talk about ecological tolerance. So let's start. Ecological tolerance is going to be based on the niche of that species that's going to have in a specific ecosystem. So a niche, just to remind you, is the functional position of that organism in the environment. And it's going to comprise the habitat of the organism, the activity pattern, which is when it hunts or when it eats or when it sleeps or where does it do so, and the resources that it needs. Okay, the physical conditions, these abiotic factors are going to play an important role. These are some of the abiotic factors that I'm going to be referring to, so you're welcome to pause the video and study them in detail. So let me give you that on a little graph, and we're going to look at an example, okay? We're going to talk about pH and I believe temperature. So that is based, these abiotic factors that I just showed you are going to decide what is the tolerance for that organism in something that's called the law of tolerance. So the law of tolerance tells me that for each abiotic factor an organism has, there is a range of tolerance for every abiotic factor. Okay, and this range of tolerance is going to be the place where that organism is going to survive. That is going to be the preferred niche of that organism. So on this graph, if we take pH as an example, pH, when the pH for that specific population, this specific species, has a certain number, that's going to be their optimal range. That means where more number of organisms survive. Now, they're also going to have a tolerance range, which is when this organism is going to be trying to adapt. Many of them might not, depending on the organism. So that is the zone of physiological stress. That is called a marginal niche because the organism is stressed and is trying to adapt to that change, in this case of pH, right, or temperature or any other abiotic factor. And in the zone of intolerance, the organism is simply going to die. So there is no niche available for that organism. Okay, so that's going to depend on the habitat where the organism lives. For example, some organisms prefer this type of habitat, and they are very good at adapting to that specific environment. But maybe this organism might not be able to adapt to the savanna over here, right? The polar bears. So they're going to have some preference for specific habitats. Okay. Now, there is some other organisms that have a habitat range, so they can adapt to different kinds of habitats. For example, lichens over here, they can just live on different kinds of environments. And the reason why they can adapt to different habitats is because they can also adapt to different resources available, like the amount of humidity or the amount of nutrients. And that actually is a plus to that organism because it's going to reduce the competition with other organisms for the same habitat. However, habitat extreme might influence the amount of growth in the case of plants. So you're going to see that when the habitat becomes extreme, the plants growth might decrease for many of the plant species. Okay, there is also what is called the microhabitats. So microhabitats are little tiny habitats inside big habitats, such as these wood or this bark and where the woodlice live. And what's happening is that the conditions in this microhabitat might be different from the conditions around in the rest of the habitat. So these type of microhabitats are good for invertebrates. And just so you know, that doesn't define the rest of the habitat in this ecosystem. Okay, another example. We've probably seen some organisms are not able to adapt very much, so they're going to want to stay at a constant temperature. But other organisms, right, we're homeotherms, but other organisms might be able to adapt to a longer or wider range of temperature changes. Another example, the salmon, right? If we have salmon that's going to go through the different stages of life cycle, actually, during the different stages of life cycle, it's going to adapt to different salinity levels. So it has to have that capability, right? One of the reasons how it does that is because of some salt glands on the gills that are going to be able to excrete the excess salt when it changes from levels of salinity. But there are other organisms that if we switch them from their habitat, the range of tolerance is zero. They would not be able to adapt. Okay. Another example, another abiotic factors, oxygen levels. If we take these two species over here, the top minnow and the shiner fish, we're going to see that the range of tolerance for the top minnow is going to be broader. That means it's going to be able to adapt to more variation of oxygen levels. So when oxygen levels are lower or higher, it might be okay with it in comparison to the shiner, right? The shiner is going to not be able to adapt to as much oxygen level variation as the top minnow. Okay, that was it. Now I'm going to do 2.6 and then 2.5. So for adaptations are going to help these organisms to get this tolerance range that I've been explaining. That's what I need to join these 2.6. So adaptations, for example, are features that these organisms have that will help them to survive and reproduce in that specific habitat. How does it happen? It has happened through the evolutionary changes when they became the species that they are, right? When speciation occurred and they became that specific species. And I want to make a little pause just in case. Speciation, there are two types of speciation, allopatric and sympatric speciation. Allopatric on different geographic locations and sympatric on the same geographic location. Just because there might have been some isolation of that specific population that might have produced a speciation. Anyway, through this process of speciation, organisms have gotten these adaptations or these features in order to survive and reproduce. There are three types of adaptations. We have behavioral, physiological, and structural adaptations. For example, if we looked at these two birds over here, these two predators over here, this is going to be a diurnal predator, and this is going to be a nocturnal predator. So diurnal predator is going to have, if you remember your bio classes, in the retina, is going to have more cone cells than rod cells. The nocturnal animal, on the other hand, is going to have rod cells instead, right? And another adaptation is not only going to happen on the amount of cells or the type of cells in the retina or the eye, it's going to happen also in the type of flight that they do. So, for example, for the spotted owl, this spotted owl, it has these micro feathers as part of their feather structure because that would help to absorb the sound at night so it can fly without producing a sound. Thus, it does not alert the prey and you can feel it or hear it when it's approaching the prey. So that's another adaptation. Okay, why do they adapt? What are the purposes? Because of their, again, activity patterns. If they hunt at night or during the day, just for locomotion, they might need stronger legs to jump or to move around or to run from predators, to defend resources, to avoid predators for reproduction or feeding. Okay, some of these adaptations might be combined with each other and they don't have to have the same types of adaptations individual types of adaptations, so they can combine them. Right, we can observe over here one type of adaptation with the size of the ear that we talked about in class today. So these ears have the adaptation of reducing the amount of heat that enters the body by just radiating the heat back to the environment, right? Because of the amount of blood vessels that will allow the vasodilation and all that. Now, this will be a structural adaptation, but if we talked about behavioral adaptations, we can see other organisms that will look for different ways to adapt to, let's say, changes in temperature, such as the iguanas, right? The iguanas are going to have to sunbathe, and that's how they regulate their temperature. The elephants, or if they are looking for shade, in the case of some chickens over here, or if we have the hurdles for penguins. So those are behavioral adaptations that we observe. Okay, other adaptations, we've seen that regulation of temperature is a big one over here. So we have some of those carnivores having those adaptations. What happens if it gets too cold? We have also developed adaptations, but we can have on some birds these specific adaptations by adapting a certain position or by holding one of those legs up. I don't know if you've ever seen that example. I think you have, but if not, just pause the video and read about it. Some adaptations for maintaining temperature in the body. Okay, how about plants? Not only animals have adaptations. Plants have also got these very specific features. Their features are based on the amount of water that they want to hold and the defenses they want to have in terms of predation. So some of those adaptive features are how can they improve or increase the amount of water that they hold in very harsh environments, or if they will be exposed to predators if they produce a poison or if they produce spines or thorns. Those are the main adaptations. But there are other adaptations in the shape of roots. So we don't see those adaptations very easily, but these adaptations will change depending on the soil type, right? The habitat in which they are. So some of them need to reach farther for water resources, or they need to be more stable, so they need to be more spread out, or because of the amount of nutrients in that soil. One specific example is the mangrove adaptations. So the type of species or plant species in mangroves are going to have these type of roots that you can see over here, that they have these formations called the pneumatophores. The pneumatophores are going to help the plants that grow in mangroves to be able to take in oxygen from the atmosphere itself. Okay, because this level in mangroves does not have a lot of oxygen. Okay, so mangroves don't have a lot of oxygen. So because of this poor oxygen soil, is going to have to use this adaptation. Now, also mangrove soils are not very stable. So they need to have this root system that is not, that is going to let them be stable at one specific location. That's why they have this very weird root system. They also have to be adapted to the levels of salinity. There is a lot of salt concentrations on mangroves. Okay, and so on. This is an example. Okay, in the tropical forest plants, they have a lot of rain. So they've adapted to different ways of dealing with it, such as the shape of the leaves, so the rain can just continue its way. Or if they want to reach sunshine, if they're going to be at the bottom, they're never going to get that sunshine, right? So we have these epiphyte plants that will grow on branches of trees, or just very interesting kind of root system, because again, the soil is not the best one in tropical rainforests, right? As we've talked before. Okay, now let's switch a little bit to other type of niches, because we need to refer back to this. So at this point with this, don't worry about what it says on the graph. I just want you to focus on these two types of niches. The first one is the fundamental niche. So the fundamental niche is the capability of one species to have that role in the ecosystem. So if that species would have a perfect environment, that would represent its fundamental niche, all the capability of that activity for that species on that environment. However, because no environment is perfect, most species only get to do their realized niche. So the realized niche is the niche that a species get to do, the real niche, okay, in other words. So I'm going to show this picture again after I explain a few more things. Why do we care about niche types? Because we need to know how that niche changes in terms of interactions with other species and in terms of disturbances and adaptations. Okay, so let's understand this concept. Okay, so if you remember, the types of interaction between organisms are going to be like symbiosis, predation, competition. And let me pause on competition and remind you that two main types of competition, intraspecific and intraspecific, right? Between individuals of the same species and between different species. So this competition has a very big role and is going to drive what is the niche size in this case. So competition is going to affect the size of the realized niche of the competitor, okay? So this is going to depend on the intensity of the competition and the type of competition. So if we look at figure 1 over here, niche are going to be narrower if there is moderate intraspecific competition. Moderate, not too much, right? There is moderate. So the realized niche of a species is going to be here in the middle. It gets narrower, right? Now, how about if there is more than moderate? There is intense intraspecific competition between two species, right? Intense. So that's going to result in a niche being very narrow because there is a lot of competition. So the niche has been reduced. Now, if we talked about intraspecific competition, which has to do with the individuals from one species only, actually that's going to broaden or open up the niche, because what's happening is that these individuals are going to try to be using or maximizing the use of those resources, so they might have to occupy these suboptimal conditions to occupy this niche. So their tolerance range increases in this case. Okay, so there is this principle that you probably heard before, is the Gauss's principle. So it's called the competitive exclusion principle. And what it says is that when two or more resource-limited species have identical patterns of resource use, let's say in this case we have two different species having the same resource use, which would be the beetles, let's call them beetles, or insects or whatever, having identical patterns of the resource use, they cannot coexist. So what's going to happen? One of those species is going to outcompete the other one and probably eliminate it. It's going to eliminate it. So if two species are competing for the same resources, the resource curve is going to overlap. Which one is the resource curve? The bell curve that I show you on the graph. So let's go back to that curve. So over here, right, if we have the yellow species, the yellow bird species, and the red bird species, there's going to be a competition which will be shown in the zone of overlap because they are both using the same resource. Again, if we have, in a way, a strong competitor and a weak competitor, the weak competitor cannot do the fundamental niche. It would only be able to do the realized niche because it's a weak competitor. I hope you understand this. Okay, now the niche differentiation again happens because of the intraspecific competition. Usually intraspecific between a species is going to be less, right, than the intraspecific competition because of the overlap that I just showed you on the graph, right? Now the overlap is not going to be complete, right? If it's not complete, then it's less intense. Now, if it overlaps completely, then it will be more intense. Okay, now the species with similar ecological requirements might reduce the competition by exploring different microhabitats or different sections on that ecosystem. For example, we have these damselfish in Australia, in the reef in Australia, and they are different variations of the same species, and they're going to explore different areas of the habitat. So some of them will explore the reef flat, or the reef crest, or the reef slope. So they don't really push each other away. They're just using different resources, okay? Another example, competition in a eucalyptus. We're going to have that in a eucalyptus, the different sections, the canopy, subcanopy, different bird species are going to forage on the different heights on the different sections of the canopy. That will not drive them away. There might be some overlap, some competition between species on the same region or the same space, but not between species on the different sections, right? So that reduces competition. Okay, 2.5, natural disturbances. These are the objectives just from the guide. So let's do disturbances. Natural disturbances, we have the natural ones that come from just natural events. I don't have much to explain about these ones. They happened. Sometimes, often in other places, not that often in different parts of the world, but they can cause a lot of damage. And we cannot measure, we don't have a way to measure that natural disruptions cause more or less damage than human disruptions. So just so you know, okay, that's actually on the guide. But there are human disruptions, and these are the ones that I want to focus on. To remember these human disruptions, you can use this mnemonic. It's called HIPCO. This mnemonic phrase is called HIPCO. I don't know if it makes sense to you, but that's what it is. So we're going to go through every single human disruption over here. Okay, there are 6 human disruptions. So let's start. Habitat destruction is the greatest cause of biodiversity loss. Okay, from all the other ones that I just mentioned, is the greatest one because of different reasons, right? Like grazing or like dams building or urbanization or anything. Habitat destruction is the worst. So less than 1% of the North America's Great Plains, for example, is the only one that remains. And the grassland bird populations have declined, almost by 99%, right? And that is not good because we are driving this biodiversity because of this main cause, which is habitat destruction. Number 2, HIPCO. What would be the second one? Well, another habitat destruction. This is just to remind you that there is also marine habitats that we are destructing, not only land, not only terrestrial habitats. So just some facts that you can check. Okay, invasive species, right, HIPCO? So the second one would be invasive species. So invasive species is a non-native species that gets there because of accident or because with an intentional reason it was introduced. But again, it doesn't belong to that ecosystem. So what happens is, if you remember from island biogeography, usually species that are endemic and some species that are in islands, they are specialist species. But these invasive species are usually generalist, and that's a problem because they are very vulnerable to the introduction of invasive species. However, invaders or invasive species, they don't have predators, they don't have competitors, they are generalists, they can just go and do whatever they want. And that has cost different countries a lot of money to just kind of cut them out or like just get them out of the place or repair what they've damaged, right? So like in California, for example, we have the bullfrog and we have the ice plant. These two are invasive species in California, and they have caused a lot of damage. There are in other places, we have the kudzu, this invasive vine that is just gonna kind of grow and take over whatever it can climb to, right? There are other invasive species over here. Where are they native from? Where are they invasive in? And what are the effects that they have caused? Next one, HIPCO, pollution. Our first P is pollution. So pollution, again, we have 7 types of pollution. There are pictures for every single one. I don't have to explain what is pollution, but they cause less damage than habitat destruction that we mentioned already, or invasive species. Okay, but it's also another human disruption. The next P, HIPCO, population. So population growth is a problem, is a disruptor because of the amount of resources that we need in order to sustain the population. Remember that when we have a lot of human growth, we're going to need more resources. And for that, we're going to kind of go to the ecosystem and ask for them, probably not in the best way. So we're driving, right? Remember those driving forces? The driving forces will increase, driving the biodiversity to decrease and providing less ecosystem services, okay? This is another look at how this population growth affects biodiversity and how it's a human disruption, or how it's an example of human disruption. So for example, the mass supply of food the mass production of food, right? How much do we need to actually provide food for everybody? Is it done properly? No, it's not. There are other resources that because of this growth, we have to, or we require, or we have to deal with, and the consequences of it. So take a look at this. You can pause the video to have an idea. Okay, climate change. So climate change, it's another HIPCO. We're almost there. So climate change is how the climate has changed over geological time and for many reasons. So there is normal climate change that has always happened because of the Earth's movement, right? Or the solar energy, the radiation that is always being getting to the Earth. And greenhouse gases have always been produced. So if we look at this graph over here, we're going to look at some of the history going back 800,000 years. And we can see that this is actually representing the glaciation periods. Okay, so these lower sections are the glaciation periods, and these top crests are going to be representing the interglaciation periods. So the studies show that during these interglaciation periods, which were when the Earth was warmer, this is when they observe that there is a higher amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it kind of matches, right? It kind of matches the interglaciation periods with the amount of carbon dioxide. Now, if you look at the axis of the carbon dioxide concentration, we have concentration going from on a range of 180 parts per million by volume to around 280-ish, right? Parts per million by volume. So that has always been the case. Remember this number. What's the maximum it has ever reached in the last 800,000 years? It has been 280 parts per million. Now, we also know, I just want to remind you, what are some examples of the greenhouse gases. This chart over here is representing the amount of greenhouse gases and how they have a spike after the Industrial Revolution that was about 1750, right? not only carbon dioxide, just in general, the greenhouse gases have spiked up a lot. Okay, so let's continue talking about carbon dioxide. So after the Industrial Revolution, this amount of carbon dioxide, this concentration has increased dramatically. So remember how it was 280 max or 300 that we had parts per million of carbon dioxide? Well, after 1750, we have increased that amount to about 400, right? 400 parts per million by volume. So that is actually a record that has been done by the Mauna Loa Observatory. So this amount of carbon dioxide is showing that it has increased to levels that have not been seen before. Now, I want to use the analogy of a carbon bathtub, right? Remember the sources in zinc on an ecosystem? The sources of carbon are going to be all the inputs I'm going to provide the atmosphere with. Carbon comes from fossil fuel combustion, from deforestation, from any kind of combustion that's happening. All of that is going to add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere over here, that's represented by the bathtub. And we're going to have our beautiful trees and algae being the sinks of the carbon dioxide. However, we have not given those things a proper time to take the carbon dioxide in. So because we have deforestation happening, there is not enough removal of carbon dioxide. So this bathtub is getting full, right? It's getting filled with that carbon dioxide. And if you remember, the greenhouse layer and the formation of the gases, or the gases forming the greenhouse layer, is going to allow the sun radiation to get trapped and increase the amount of temperature. So because we have more carbon dioxide, that layer has more concentration of carbon dioxide, therefore increasing global temperature. And we don't have a way to get rid of it because we have gotten rid of ways that this carbon dioxide gets removed from the atmosphere. Okay, so HIPCO, the last one, is overharvesting. So we have some species that are vulnerable because we have driven them to this range of almost extinction or critically endangered because we're overharvesting. So for example, the Siberian tiger is hunted and it doesn't have any rules, any regulations, and is pretty much hunted for fun, right, because of the fur. We also see that tiger poaching happening, and there's not a lot that has been done, but we also see the overharvesting in our oceans. Actually, the oceans contain only 10% of the animals that they once did. And that is a problem because that would be decreasing the biodiversity of our oceans. So that's overharvesting. So that's HIPCO. Okay, so going back to this diagram that I showed you before, human population growth, pollution, overharvesting, and all of these human disturbances, right? HIPCO is driving the biodiversity loss. We are driving the ecosystem services that our ecosystem gives us to be reduced because of the damage we're causing. Now, this is an extra side concept that you need to know because it has been present on some test questions, and it's talking about endocrine disruptor. So an endocrine disruptor is defined as any chemical that it would enter into the food chain and it will affect, or it would have an effect in our endocrine system. There are some connections that have already been established because of the chemicals that have entered into the food chain and have caused disruption on the endocrine system. So you can refer to this table. So that's an endocrine disruptor. Okay, now going back to if an animal has adapted or has not adapted. There has been 5 mass extinctions in the past. They are located in this graph with the arrows showing where those extinctions happen. And usually the reasons for those extinctions were something like volcanic eruptions or collisions from meteors or asteroids, or some other theories that explain why those extinctions happened. So those were mass extinctions in the past. And usually on an extinction, what happens is endemic species are eliminated. Remember that endemic species are species only found to one area, such as this over here. This is a marine iguana only found in the Galapagos Islands. And this marine iguana is having issues because of the increasing temperature of the ocean. So they do not get the same amount of food because of that food has changed because of the temperature of the ocean has changed. Now, remember that if we get rid of these endemic species, the species will just drive them to extinction. So it wouldn't be extirpation like we covered on the previous video. Okay, but we have had this happening since millions of years ago, so it's not a new thing, right? People have usually hunted species and driven them to extinction every time that they arrive to islands or to continents. So those are some examples of some species that humans hunted and drove to extinction. Now, scientists are talking about a sixth mass extinction, and this problem is happening because of all the human disturbances that I mentioned. So they say that these previous mass extinctions had other causes, but the sixth mass extinction would have been driven by humans. So we would be the cause of the sixth mass extinction, and that's a problem. So you just need to know that there is a concept now out there. Now, again, if the species is able to adapt to migrate, great. If not, it's gonna go extinct. Remember the lab that you did with the island biogeography and how many of your birds didn't make it to the island when you drove them through the funnel? Well, because for population and species, it's very hard to adapt or even to migrate to another habitat. They just don't make it. It's a very big change. It's not something that is on their nature. It's not even on our nature. It's not very easy to migrate and adapt. Now, let me give you an example. We've probably seen a lot of polar bears pictures in which we see that the ice is melting and the polar bear is kind of like suffering or kind of just clustered on a corner because the ice is melting. Well, there is a reason why they show those pictures, but that's not the point I want to give you over here. These are the locations where polar bears live. Those are the habitats where they are. These represent different populations of polar bears in that area. And the reason why global warming is relating them to their destruction of habitat is because polar bears need the ice in order to hunt seals. So because this ice melts faster or it melts earlier, right? Usually they hunt during spring and summer, but because this ice is retreating earlier in spring, what's happening is they have less time to prey and they're gonna go longer amount of time during the year without food. And that is what is actually the danger for polar bears. Okay, so we have these organizations that are trying to determine which species are endangered or are threatened. So they gave this code. If you look at it, this is the code that they use for each type of species. So for example, the California condor, if you look up its level of or its conservation status is critically endangered, right? So this species is critically endangered. We also have over here humans, right? Homo sapiens. We have been classified as least concern. We are not making it to the list of anything else. Now there is criteria for classifying these organisms on these different lists or these different categories. These are the criteria that they use. And specifically, if you ever heard about the red list categories, they are using these criteria to place organisms on the red list category. And this is some example from the red list that shows the different groups of species or the different groups of animals and how they make it to the red list or not. Okay, there is also the Endangered Species Act that was founded in 1973, and this Endangered Species Act, or ESA, it was founded so they could protect the species and the ecosystem in which they depend on. For example, one of the species that they have saved, we're going to call it like that, is the bald eagle. So the bald eagle was down in population number up to 500 breeding pairs, but after they were put into a conservation list, they were endangered. They actually have risen the population numbers to a lot of more individuals, so they are not endangered anymore. Now, there are other species that are on that list, and for example, that cause a lot of debate. Those are the grizzly bears. So the grizzly bears, There are some people that agree that they should be on the list. There are people that say no, take them out. There was a big issue in Montana about it. So all of these populations, again, they go through a lot of studies and a lot of criteria, like I show you over here, to determine in which category they need to be put. Now, there is also the Convention on Biological Diversity that was a treaty that many of the countries that you see on this map in green, signed in order to protect biodiversity. Now, one thing is that they sign, and another thing is that they actually get to do something about it. And this is the last map that I've shown you in 2.1, just so you join all the different topics of biodiversity that we've been talking about, okay? And that's it for today.